Last week we said that the government has a really powerful tool in fiscal policy, which involves changes in government spending and changes in taxes. We talked about how these different policies work across the economy, how they should be used for the different gaps we identify in an economy. We talked about the multiplier, the crowding out effect, which affect how the magnitude of the impact of any fiscal policy on the economy. So what we're going to do this week is just focus on the parts of fiscal policy that we hear the most about, which are its results in terms of deficit and in terms of debt. So we want to define those, we want to see what they look like around the world, and then we'll go on to see how governments actually do borrow, what markets look like. So we said last week that the government's two tools are government spending and taxes, but we didn't talk about deficits. Well, clearly, when you have government spending and taxes, if they are equal, then we have what we call a balanced budget. All right? Not very many governments have that, but it does happen. If government spending happens to be larger than taxes, then we have what we call a deficit. Now, there are lots of different deficits out there, so I want to be sure we get the terminology right. This is a fiscal deficit, a budget deficit, a public sector deficit, all right? We refer to them in different ways. Government deficit, always having to do with government spending and government tax collection. So if government spending is greater than total tax collection, then we have a deficit. And if, on the other hand, total tax collection is bigger than government spending, then we have a surplus. This fiscal surplus, public sector surplus, budget surplus, government surplus are all terms that you'll hear to refer to this. So we have three possibilities: a deficit, a balanced budget, a surplus. Normally when we talk about government's deficits, we measure them as a percent of the country's GDP that same year. Okay, to see why this makes sense, imagine that I overspend and some very, very wealthy American overspends, and we overspend by the same amount. Is my overspending as serious as his? Well, no, because his total income is much bigger than mine. So what we do is we take our overspending, our deficit, we divide it by the GDP, or the income of the country in the year in question, and there we get an idea of the magnitude of that deficit in relation to the economy, and we also can compare countries, and we can compare over time, okay? So that's what a deficit is. Now, obviously, when a government has a deficit, it has to get the money from somewhere, and we're going to talk about how that happens in just a few minutes. But when the government borrows the money to cover its deficit, it adds it to a debt, which is its accumulated borrowing over time. And again, this debt can be government debt. We talk about public sector debt, right? National debt. This is all the money owed by the government as a result of many accumulated years of borrowing, okay? We also take these debt numbers and divide them by nominal GDP for each relevant year to see how big the debt is. Because just like me and that wealthy American, maybe my total debt and his total debt are the same size, but our incomes are different. So my debt would be more serious than his. So we take the debt in the national currency, we divide it by GDP in the national currency for the same time period, and we get a figure for debt that now allows us to compare what's happening to it over time and how it looks between countries. We also get some targets in this way that we'll be talking about later. So if we look at this slide, which this comes from the Google Public Data Explorer, so that we can look at what countries look like in terms of their deficits and in terms of their debts, expressed in the way that I just mentioned to you, which is the deficit and then later the debt, divided by GDP for each year. So if you look at this screen, you can see a group of countries. I tried to pick some representative countries, and we'll see if we can highlight them to see what they look like. So here's the United States. This is the deficit as a percent of GDP. So obviously, looking at this picture, you can see the zero up there, a little ways up there, okay? If the country had a balanced budget, then we would be on the zero line, Okay, now you can see very clearly that the United States doesn't have very many balanced budgets. So you can see, for example, most of the period, you can see the deficits running 2 to 4% of GDP, sometimes larger. You can see that when we get into the early 2000s, there was a surplus. And it was quite a large surplus for a little period. And then you can see that the budget plunges back down into deficit. You can see how large that deficit gets at the bottom of the worst year of the financial crisis, which it was almost 13% of GDP, that deficit. Now, normally in the U.S. papers, people are saying the deficit is X trillion dollars and we'll never be able to repay it. Again, in order to make sense of that deficit, look for the number that tells you how big that deficit is as a percent of GDP, because it helps us to evaluate it better. And if you look again at the United States, you can see that things are getting better in recent years. After 2009, which was the worst, we can see the deficit is getting smaller. However, it's still projected by 2018 to be that there will be a deficit, and it will be about 4% of GDP, all right? If we look at other countries, so if we look up here at China, for instance, we can see that China actually has smaller deficits than the United States, and it's got some surpluses over time, okay? If you look at, for example, Denmark, and this is kind of a surprising situation, because Denmark has a very big welfare state, which means it needs it has a lot of government spending, it needs a lot of taxes to cover that spending. Look at how big the surpluses are in Denmark many years. Okay, we're talking about surpluses of maybe 5% of GDP. That means the taxes they collect are bigger than their government spending, even though government spending is more than half of GDP. So sometimes countries actually do balance their budgets. Now, for a sort of a depressing contrast, we can see Greece here. You know that Greece has been immersed in the Eurozone crisis, and it's been in recession for 5 years. You can see that in Greece, those deficits have been enormous. We see a deficit that reaches almost 16% of GDP at the bottom of this financial crisis. So there's one group of figures. Now, if we go to the government debt, okay, on this other chart, again, you can see that there's a big difference. If we divide this debt by GDP, you can see down here at the bottom, China, with a very small debt as a percent of GDP, okay? It's running around 20 to 30%, all right? That's a very manageable debt. We'll talk about the numbers a little bit later. You can see Denmark as well down here. Denmark, again, with its huge welfare state, with a very small debt, all right, as a percent of GDP. That means it's going to spend less money on interest payments. We go up here and we can see Germany, France, the UK with higher debts. Then we see the United States with a debt that is now above 100% of GDP and kind of stabilizing as we go forward. So it's not rising as much, kind of flattening out, but still at a very high level. And then we go up and we see countries whose debt divided by GDP is even higher. Okay, so we can see Italy, for example, 120% of GDP. At the end of this period, we can see Greece, which actually rises almost to 180% of GDP before starting to fall. And we can see the country with the largest public debt in the world, which is Japan, at about 240% of GDP. So you can see there's a lot of variation here. And I hope that this chart reminds you that when we talk about our country's national debt, and we talk about the U.S. national debt, and we're alarmed because it's past $15 trillion, we should also remember we need to see it in relation to our country's GDP each year and see whether it's growing, whether it's shrinking, whether it's remaining stable, and how that level divided by GDP compares to other countries. It's the only way we can make sense out of it. So just to review and to put all of this into perspective, let's remember what we talked about last week. Here's a quiz question. I'd like you to think about our last discussion, think about the business cycle, and tell me, in a time of recessionary gap, what would be more typical for a country, a surplus or a deficit? Obviously, based on our discussion last week and based on the definitions you now know, in a recessionary gap, what's going to happen is government spending will go up, taxes will go down, the government's budget will go deeper into deficit. So it's typical in recessionary gaps to see either deficits or larger deficits than we had before, okay? In contrast, in an inflationary gap, we are likely to see, or we should see, budgets turning into surplus, or at least deficits that get smaller. Okay, so this will vary automatically across the business cycle due to the automatic stabilizers that we talked about last week, and the fact that governments often use policy to try to correct those gaps in the economy, to stabilize the economy, and that policy will generate deficits at the time of the recessionary gap, surpluses at the time of the inflationary gap if it's used correctly.